The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
Most people think they know the story of Princess Diana, the shy kindergarten teacher who became a global icon, the devoted mother, the humanitarian who walked through minefields and held the hands of AIDS patients when the rest of the world was too frightened to go near them, the woman the entire planet mourned on that terrible August morning in 1997. But here's the part of her story that almost nobody talks about, and the part that the royal establishment has worked quietly for decades to keep buried. When Diana sat down and wrote her will, she did something extraordinary. She did not simply divide her fortune between her sons and walk away into the afterlife quietly. She engineered a plan, deliberate, precise, and deeply personal, that handed the keys to her entire legacy to one single person, not a senior royal, not a palace lawyer, not even a close member of her aristocratic family. One person who knew every secret, every sorrow, and every silent wish she had ever carried. And the consequences of that decision have rippled outward for nearly 30 years, touching everything from anti-landmine treaties to the collapse of Harry and Meghan's relationship with the crown. This is the story that changes everything you thought you knew about Diana, Princess of Wales. To understand why Diana made the choices she made in her will, you have to understand who she really was. Not the curated image that Buckingham Palace preferred the world to see, but the real woman underneath the tiaras and the public engagements. Diana Frances Spencer was born in 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate. She grew up at Althorpe, surrounded by the rituals and expectations of British aristocratic life. But her childhood was not the fairy tale it might appear from the outside. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was just 6 years old, and the divorce was messy, painful, and deeply scarring for all the children involved. Diana later said that she never fully recovered from a sense of abandonment she felt during those years. That wound, quietly carried, would shape everything she became. By the time she was 20 years old, she was working as a kindergarten assistant in London, patient, warm, and completely unassuming. When she began dating Prince Charles, the British press transformed her almost overnight into something otherworldly, a blushing, innocent young woman perfectly suited to breathe new life into an aging monarchy. And on the 29th of July, 1981, when she walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in a gown with a 25-foot train while 750 million people watched on television, it really did seem as though a fairy tale had come true. But fairy tales have a way of cracking under the weight of real life. Almost from the beginning, Diana's marriage was defined by distance, loneliness, and the long shadow of Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana later said she had felt Camilla's presence even before the wedding day. Behind the palace walls, she struggled in ways the public could not see, developing bulimia as she searched desperately for some form of control in a world that seemed to belong to everyone but her. The institution she had married into valued composure above all things. Diana was a woman overflowing with emotion, with empathy, with a hunger for genuine human connection that the royal machinery simply could not accommodate. The marriage formally collapsed in 1992, the same year that intimate recordings of Charles and Camilla's conversations were made public and shocked the world. Diana's response was not to retreat quietly. In 1995, she sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for a panorama interview that stunned the globe. She spoke calmly, clearly, and with devastating honesty about the loneliness, the affairs, the bulimia, and the suffocating isolation of royal life. She famously suggested that there had been 3 people in her marriage. It was not a confession. It was a declaration of independence. From that moment forward, Diana was not simply a princess. She was something more dangerous to the establishment. A woman who understood the power of public perception better than the institution that had tried to contain her. What made Diana truly remarkable was not her beauty or her fame. It was what she chose to do with both. In 1987, while public fear about AIDS was at its most intense and most irrational, Diana walked into the AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital and shook hands, without gloves, with patients who had been effectively abandoned by polite society. This was not a minor gesture. At the time, A significant portion of the population genuinely believed that the virus could be transmitted through casual contact. Politicians were reluctant to even speak about the epidemic openly. Diana's single act of uncovered human touch sent a message around the world that no government press release could have managed. She was saying, plainly and without words, that these people deserved dignity and that fear was not an acceptable substitute for compassion. The ripple effects were measurable. Public attitudes toward people living with HIV began to shift. Fundraising for AIDS research accelerated. The stigma that had been strangling an entire community began, slowly, to loosen. One woman's willingness to reach out her bare hand changed the trajectory of a global health crisis. Then came Angola in January 1997, just 8 months before her death. Diana walked through fields that still contained active landmines, in jeans and a flak jacket, but without the elaborate security that typically surrounded any royal figure. The photographs circled the globe in hours. Governments that had been slow to act on the landmine crisis suddenly found themselves facing uncomfortable public pressure. The Ottawa Treaty, which committed signatory nations to banning anti-personnel mines, was signed later that same year. By 2023, more than 160 countries had signed on, and tens of millions of mines had been destroyed. Diana's walk through that field in Angola contributed directly to that outcome. The royal family's private response to Diana's humanitarian work was, by most accounts, deeply uncomfortable. The institution valued controlled, traditional royal charity, the ribbon-cutting kind, the kind that didn't challenge governments or make headlines for the wrong reasons. Diana's approach was different. She went where the pain was. She sat with patience. She held orphaned children. She made the powerful feel embarrassed by their inaction. Charles reportedly described her campaigning as attention-seeking. Diana, by then, had stopped caring what the institution thought of her. She had found something far more powerful than royal approval. She had found her purpose. By 1996, Diana's divorce from Charles was finalized. She was 35 years old, stripped of her HRH title, free of the marriage but still surrounded by its wreckage. The custody arrangements for William and Harry were a source of ongoing pain. The press followed her every movement. The palace, though no longer formally her home, still exerted gravitational pull on every aspect of her public life. And yet, in the middle of all of that turbulence, Diana sat down and did something quietly remarkable. She wrote her will. The estate she was working with was not small. Through her divorce settlement, book royalties, jewelry sales, and other income, she had accumulated approximately £17 million. What she chose to do with it reveals more about who she was than almost anything else in the public record. The bulk of her estate, the majority of it, was directed toward charitable causes that had defined her humanitarian work: AIDS research and care, organizations supporting the victims of landmines, and initiatives focused on children without families. This was not a token gesture toward charity. It was a structural decision. Diana was ensuring that the work she had done during her lifetime would continue to generate resources and attention after she was gone. She was building a mechanism for her values to outlive her. A portion was also set aside in trust for her sons, William and Harry. But Diana was careful about how she structured this. She did not simply hand over a lump sum. The trusts were carefully constructed to provide her boys with financial security and independence. Independence, crucially, from the palace system that she knew could be suffocating. She wanted them protected. She also wanted them free. But the most consequential decision she made, the one that would set off decades of controversy, legal drama, and royal fury, was her choice of executor. Diana appointed Paul Burrell as the executor of her estate. Burrell had served as her butler for a decade, but the word butler does not begin to capture what he was to her. He had been present through her darkest moments, the years of marital collapse, the battle with bulimia, the loneliness that had settled around her like a second skin inside those palace walls. He had kept her secrets. He had sat with her in the small hours when the weight of everything became too much. He was, by all accounts, one of the very few people she trusted without reservation. By naming him executor, Diana gave him extraordinary authority. He had the legal power to manage and distribute every element of her estate: the jewelry, the property, the personal belongings, and the charitable funds. He could determine which organizations received money, how personal possessions were handled, and crucially, how Diana's story was told and preserved. In one decisive stroke, she placed her entire legacy in the hands of someone who was not a palace insider, not an aristocrat, and not a royal advisor. The establishment was effectively shut out. The reaction from Buckingham Palace was immediate and intense. A butler, a common household servant, in the palace's language, suddenly held more power over the most famous woman in the world's story than any member of the royal family. Lawyers circled. There were whispered conversations about Diana's state of mind at the time of the will's signing, about possible amendments, about procedural challenges. None of it succeeded. The will held. In 2002, Burrell was arrested and charged with stealing more than 300 items from Diana's estate, including personal correspondence, dresses, and gifts. The trial became a global media event, partly because of what it threatened to reveal about Diana's private life and her innermost thoughts. In the end, the case collapsed dramatically when it emerged that Queen Elizabeth had been told about Burrell's possession of certain items, a detail that had somehow gone unmentioned until the trial was already underway. Burrell was cleared, but the episode had already exposed the depth of tension between him and the palace over Diana's legacy. His subsequent memoir, published in 2003 under the title A Royal Duty, caused fresh outrage within royal circles. The book drew on his intimate knowledge of Diana's life and included material from her personal correspondence. Charles reportedly called it an act of treachery. Harry later used the word betrayal, but Burrell had always maintained that he was doing exactly what Diana would have wanted, ensuring that her voice was not filtered, managed, or silenced by the institution that had spent years trying to do precisely that. What Diana set in motion with that will has proved remarkably difficult to contain. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund channeled enormous resources into AIDS research and advocacy over the years following her death, contributing to treatment advances and stigma reduction efforts that saved lives on a scale that is genuinely difficult to quantify. The funds she directed toward landmine campaigns supported work that has outlawed one of the most indiscriminate weapons in the history of warfare. Althorpe, her childhood home, became a museum and memorial site drawing 100,000 visitors a year, keeping her narrative alive for generations who were not yet born when she died. The jewelry sold through Burrell's authorized auctions also served her values in death as it had in life. A sapphire ring was sold specifically to benefit Elton John's AIDS Foundation, extending Diana's long commitment to that cause beyond anything a simple bequest could have achieved. But perhaps the most complex and emotionally charged dimension of Diana's legacy is what it did to her sons. William and Harry both inherited financial trusts that gave them a degree of independence from the palace system. But they also inherited something less tangible and far more complicated: the weight of their mother's story, her unresolved grievances with the institution, and the ongoing tension between her values and the expectations of the crown. Harry's 2023 memoir made clear how deeply he identified with his mother's sense of being trapped and mistreated by the palace machine. He described institutional structures within the royal family in terms that echoed, almost precisely, the language Diana had used in her Panorama interview nearly 30 years earlier. Whether consciously or not, he was carrying her fight forward. William's relationship with Diana's legacy has been more guarded, more shaped by his position as heir to the throne and his responsibility to the institution she had spent years challenging. The tension between the two brothers in recent years has been widely observed and widely discussed, and some who knew Diana well have suggested that she might have foreseen exactly this kind of fracture, that she understood the institution would eventually force her sons to choose between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to her values. Princess Diana did not leave her estate to the most obvious people. She did not leave it quietly or conventionally, or in a way that gave the palace any comfort. She left it in the hands of the one person she was certain would protect what mattered most to her. Not the money, not the jewelry, not even the charitable mission in its most literal form, but the truth of who she was and what she believed. For nearly 30 years, that decision has continued to generate controversy, legal battles, royal fury, and genuine humanitarian impact in almost equal measure. Her will was not merely a legal document. It was her final argument, the last and perhaps most powerful statement she ever made about the kind of world she wanted to live in and the kind of woman she had always been underneath the crown. Diana once said, in her own words, that she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. Whether she fully succeeded in that is perhaps for history to judge. But one thing is beyond question. She made certain, with great deliberateness and great courage, that she would never be entirely silenced. And she never has been.